All right, everyone. Welcome to Neurology Grand Rounds. Looks like the chat is already up and going. A little bit of news today's CME code. We'll put it in the chat in a second. Duke Neurology All-Stars, Joel Morganlander nominated all the inpatient attendings, and I couldn't agree with him more. Thank you, Joel. Does that mean everyone's going to get a coffee cup?
If I can get me.
Yeah, well, we can get them for you. Anna Lafar was nominated by Dylan Ryan for her great work in Clinic 1L, making the usual difficult processes in clinic easy for the patients. Thank you, Dylan, for the nomination. Tanzia McQueen received the AAN Resident Research Scholarship. The title of her research is Exploring the Circuit Mechanisms of Mood and Motor Dysfunction in the CD157 BST1 KO mouse. Thank you, Tanzia, and best of luck. The Neurology Holiday Party is December 16th, next Friday at 6:30 at the JB Duke. Please respond to your email whether you're coming or not. Will dug this out of the Wayback Machine in 1996. Both Don Sanders and Alan Roses made the top list of America's best doctors, which is amazing. It's a list I've never been on. And Alan Rose is quoted as saying, doctors are no good at deciding who are good doctors, but patients certainly are. We could agree. Research Roundup, Joel again and Alan Tesson were senior authors of a case discussing a rare hypoglossal nerve palsy due to a cervical osteophyte. And Suma Shah and Duke medical student Needla Masha and Mike Lutz looked at a case of rare autoimmune neuromyelitis optica disorder, NMOSD. Is that spelled right, Chris? Nice. The letters are just piling up in that field. I read this recently. It was shocking that dementia risk may increase if you're eating these foods, study says. So I think from now on, we need to avoid lettuce. Today is the birthday of Noam Chomsky, who's still alive at age 93. Oh, cut off my slide down here. For those who don't know, Noam Chomsky is a professor of linguistics at MIT. And he was someone who believed that the brain was born with an innate ability for language, which in the 50s put him in direct competition with who? Anyone know? B.F. Skinner, who was at Harvard, who believed that you were born with a blank slate. And he was the guy who would put his children in a box for a couple of years and see if they turned out better. And he would do that with his pigeons. And Chomsky said, no, that's not true. The brain is born with certain regions that are designed to do certain functions. His other great contribution was the idea of deep structure, which meant that when you talk, all languages share in common some certain elements that go back to how your brain communicates internally. He was an interesting guy because he believed that evolution could not account for the brain's ability to perform language, but he also said it wasn't learned. So he actually believed some divine force had put it there, but at the same time was an atheist, so couldn't quite explain. So that was his Achilles heel, the idea that evolution couldn't lead to language. Again, this is today's CME. There is no case today, so I wanted to encourage everyone to go to our website because there's two new calendars on it, the Grand Round calendars and the overall calendar. In addition, Will has done a really good staff website, all kinds of links for all your staff and stories about how other staff members have used these courses to go upgrades within the department, get raises and things of that sort. So please put a lot of effort into it. Please take a look at it. Okay, let's go to the introduction. is this? That's Daisy. Oh, we're back in this mode again. So, okay. That's amazing. All right. So today's, there we go. Today's speakers are Dr. Rick Bedlack and Jennifer Hamill, who's from the Department of Medicine. Welcome. Jennifer is Director of Clinical Research Administration in the Department of Medicine, which, as you can imagine, is a huge job. Rick Bedlack, as you all know, is a professor of neurology. He is also now the Stuart Hughes and Went Endowed Professorship in the department. That's Rick. You were in Hawaii when this picture was taken, I assume? Charleston. And, well-deserved and congratulations. As you all know, Rick is a man of 1,001 outfits, all of them fabulous, I would say. And he's a media whirlwind. In just the last 2 weeks, Rick's been on Dean Klotman's weekly message. He's gotten the new ALS professorship, which they talked about. He's been on the Daily Beast and received the Forbes Norris Award from the International Alliance of ALS and Motor Neuron Disease. All well deserved. Rick has built probably the premier clinical ALS program in the country. And today he's going to talk to us about, along with Jennifer, about expanded access program akin to the Dallas Buyers Club, calling it the Durham Buyers Club. So Rick and Jennifer, I will turn it over to you as soon as I put your slides up. There's Daisy. So it's showing well?
It's on your screen sharing your own presentation.
Okay, let's hit stop share. Share. There it is.
Good.
All right, even though it looks like that, the interworld is seeing it. Here you go.
All right, buddy, thanks. Thank you so much, Rich. And just one point of clarification, as the head of neurology, do you give me permission to take this mask off while I talk?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
I'm supposed to put mine on.
okay, Dean Klotman, if you're watching, he just gave me permission. He's my boss. So yeah, so as everybody knows, in the past 22 years leading the Duke ALS Clinic, I'm always on the lookout for new options that I can bring my patients, new ways to give them some hope. And in the past 5 years, I've been exploring this whole category of options that I previously knew nothing about, called expanded access programs. And I call this talk Help for the Durham Buyers Club. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Jennifer Hamill and Jessica, I forgot your last name, I apologize, Jessica Chapman, from Clinical Research Administration. They are a very important part of running expanded access programs at Duke, as you will see. So I always like to start with my disclosures. I do have some research support from the ALS Association, from Orion and Medicine Nova pharmaceutical companies, and from the Healy Center at the Mass General Hospital. I also consult for a lot of companies. Mostly what I do for these companies is help them to design clinical protocols and expanded access programs that are more patient-centric, and also serve as a member of their data safety monitoring boards to make sure that patients are safe in their trials. So what I thought I would try to run through today is some background, explain to you why our patients need access to investigational therapies, and then just briefly run through some of the different options, comparing and contrasting them, trials, self-experimentation, expanded access programs, and the newest one, the right to try pathway. I'll tell you why I prefer expanded access programs amongst this whole group. For patients who cannot participate in trials, I think that's the next best way to get them these products. But I'll show you that there's some barriers at both the sponsor and the site level. And I'll show you how, as a community, at least in ALS, we're coming together to try to solve some of these. And then I will turn it over to Jennifer, who's going to show you a step-by-step path for launching an expanded access program here at Duke, and then give you some of the numbers on who's doing these and whether they're becoming more popular or not. So some background. I mean, one of the great things about being here for 22 years is I've seen so much progress in just about every field. Even ALS, in the past 5 years, we have two new just in Sevrio. That's the good news. The bad news is that many of these products are for symptom management. Some of them, like Relivrio, have a small effect on slowing the progression of the disease, probably around 25% slowing. So most of us still don't have ways to stop or reverse the diseases that we treat. They remain disabling and life-shortening. And so it's pretty obvious that people living with these desperately and understandably want access to investigational treatments. And the desperation of this, desire is seen in some of the protests that you may have seen on the news. A protest back in 2017 for access to a drug called GM604. It's up in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. And then just this past year, a protest out in front of Biogen for access to their antisense oligonucleotide called tofersen, which targets SOD1 ALS. These are really reminiscent of scenes from the 1980s when a group called ACT for ALS, ACT UP rose up and tried to get access to investigational therapies for HIV at the time. So there are 4 pathways that I know of through which patients can access investigational treatments: clinical trials, the self-experimentation pathway, expanded access programs, and then the right to try pathway. And so hopefully we all agree that clinical trials are the preferred pathway for this. First of all, because the products in trials, they're vetted in terms of their plausibility. Usually there's a ton of preclinical research before a company decides to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to put it into clinical trials. They're pretty certain that at least hits targets in preclinical models of a disease. We also have confidence in the purity of products in trials because there's independent oversight for that. In trials, patients sign consent forms, which means that we can be reasonably confident they know exactly what they're getting into and they're agreeing to everything. Trials have a lot of oversight. Some people think too much, but there's oversight from the FDA. There's oversight at institutions from the IRB. Most trials have an independent group of clinicians and scientists called the Data Safety Monitoring Board that is the only ones that are seeing unblinded data throughout the trial so they can pick up on safety signals. And as a result of all that, I mean, you really maximize the safety of people in trials much better than any other pathway we're going to talk about. Trials, of course, do rigorous data collection, not only safety data, but efficacy data. And so no matter if a trial is positive or negative, we always learn something from it. It always moves the field forward. And then finally, there's benefits to patients who participate in trials. We already talked about the hope they can get. There's the benefit of altruism, feeling like something good is coming out of this terrible thing that happened to me and my family. I wonder if you know that there's also medical benefits for being in clinical trials. There's numerous papers that show that people who participate in trials across various diseases do better medically, no matter whether they got the drug or don't participate. That might be. Is it the hope? Is it the altruism? What else could it be?
Because they're getting monitored.
Exactly. That's probably one of the main reasons, as we see them much more frequently and we perform much more extensive evaluations on them. So if something is happening, like a DVT, a PE, a pneumonia, we probably are going to pick up on it much sooner than seeing them in clinic a few times a year. But of course, trials aren't perfect. So there's some problems. First, there's not nearly enough trials for everybody affected by these diseases. 2022 was probably the biggest year ever in the history of ALS research. At its peak, we had 2,000 spots open in the whole United States for people that wanted to be in clinical trials. Anybody know how many people live with ALS in the United States? About 30,000. So even if everybody tomorrow wanted to be in one of these trials and qualified, we wouldn't have nearly enough spots. Another problem is that trials require an infrastructure, a pretty big infrastructure. There's got to be coordinators, regulatory support. There's got to be IRBs. There's got to be a decent sized patient population. As a result, trials are only offered in certain places. Typically, large academic medical centers are the ones that do trials, typically in urban areas, most commonly along the coasts of the United States. Turns out there are a paucity of sites that do trials in the center of the United States, especially in rural areas. So if you live in one of those areas, you might not have access to trials. Even if you're in a place where they have trials, chances are you might not qualify for the trials. So in ALS, our inclusion criteria are actually getting more, not less, narrow. So first of all, we're getting smarter about the fact that ALS is not just one disease. And we're now starting to see trials that target different specific genetic subtypes. I mentioned earlier tofersen, which targets SOD1 mutations. There's several other antisense trials underway targeting different genetic causes of ALS. And of course, those are only open to that small percentage of people with ALS who have that as an identifiable cause for their disease. Also, for people where we can't find the cause, we're starting to see that there's a certain type of patient who's most likely to be able to show us an approvable signal using the outcome measures that we have in ALS. And so the main outcome measure that we use in ALS trials, the one that gets drugs approved, is called the ALS Functional Rating Scale. It's a measure of disability. Those of you that have been in my clinic have used it. It's 12 questions. Each question is scored between 0 and 4. So each question pertains to some bodily function like speaking or swallowing or walking. 4 means you do it perfectly. 0 means you can't do it at all. And so in order to show a 25% slowing on that scale in a 6-month trial, first of all, you need people who have a lot of points. You can't take somebody who has 0 points on the scale to start with. Second, you've got to take somebody who's changing fairly quickly. You can't take somebody who's going to change by 1 point every 10 years into a 6-month trial and expect to slow progression by 25%. And so, you know, the types of inclusion criteria that we're seeing now automatically exclude about 90% of the patients that are in my clinic. And then amongst that 10% who's lucky enough to be here where we do trials and qualifies, there's a fair number of patients who don't like some of the features that mainstream clinical trials have. For example, placebos, and it's understandable. You know, if you have a disabling life-shortening illness and you're going to get one chance at a clinical trial, and I tell you there's a 50-50 risk of a placebo, I could see why that might not sit well with you. Also, everybody that comes here is not necessarily living close to us. And so if you're 4 or 5 hours away and I'm asking you to come in once a week for an experimental IV infusion, that's quite a burden. And for a long time, there was really only one other pathway for people that couldn't or didn't want to be in trials, and that's the self-experimentation pathway. So this is where people would just buy and try products, mainly things that I call alternative and off-label products. This is still the main pathway that I would say 90% of the folks who don't qualify for trials who have ALS use. And there's really sort of different sub-pathways. One is that you could take a prescription medicine that's approved for something else in the United States by asking your doctor for it. So over the course of my career, I've seen people ask me for prescriptions for an antibiotic called minocycline that we had in a clinical trial at one time. And I've seen them ask me for a prescription for something called sodium phenylbutyrate, a histone deacetylase inhibitor that was part of that drug Relyvrio that just got approved. And I'm generally open to writing those prescriptions as long as people agree to come in and be monitored by me. Another pathway is where people want a drug that's approved in another country, but it's not approved here for anything yet. That's where you would have to help them through something called the FDA's personal importation policy. And so some experience that I have with that is the drug clenbuterol, which we did a trial on. It's one of the only positive trials that I've actually participated in where we saw what looked like a positive signal. People did better on this beta agonist. And so for a long time, I had people that wanted me to help them get that from other countries, and we did. But most commonly, people who use this pathway engage in something which I call a buyer's club. This is nothing new. It's been happening since the days of the Wild West, when wagons used to come into town and people that we now call snake oil salesmen would sell various products out of the back of those wagons. There's a really nice depiction of a buyer's club in Dallas in a 2013 movie that Matthew McConaughey starred in. This was in the HIV community. He was traveling down to Mexico, loading up his car with various experimental products and selling them out of a hotel room in Dallas, Texas. But most commonly, what happens is, I'm not sure how to get rid of that, Will. Do you know?
It's not on the remote viewers, so.
It's not actually,
Here.
I don't have it on my screen though. That's the thing. Yeah. Very strange. Oh, it's on, Rich.
Stay.
There you go. Good job, Rich. Yeah, that's why you're the boss. So most commonly nowadays, buyers clubs are on the internet. And so if you happen to be on your phone, which I see several of you are, and you Google ALS research or ALS treatment, you will find tens of thousands of products that are advertised to slow, stop, or reverse this disease. So shown here are just a handful of those. Now, there's several problems with this pathway, especially on the internet. The first is that the information that's used to support claims of efficacy and safety for these products is not always complete or even accurate. The second is many of these products actually don't have any plausible mechanism by which they could affect ALS. And we don't know anything about the purity of some of these things that are being sold. Most of the time, there's no informed consent, there's no oversight of any kind, there's no data collection, there's no reporting. And sadly, there are many examples of harm that have come to people who've engaged in this sort of self-experimentation. Just a couple of examples that I cut and pasted there. One published in the New England Journal from a patient who went to another country and bought stem cells for their neurological disease and came back and developed a tumor, which when biopsied was found to be comprised of someone else's cells, not his. So his family spent $10,000 at this stem cell clinic and got injected with cancer cells. Another one here in Germany from a place called the XL Center that killed a baby and yet continued to advertise itself as perfectly safe even after this happened. So some of you know, this frustrated me. And so, about 13 years ago, I created this program called ALS Untangled. Some people call it the ALS X-Files. And it's designed to try to help patients and families make more informed decisions about these products that are for sale. So patients submit ideas, we post them on a virtual bulletin board on our website. We allow the community to vote. The ones that get the most votes are then assigned to one of our team members. We have 130 clinicians from across 11 countries working on this together. And that team member then writes and ultimately crowdsources and publishes a review on that topic. And we now do podcasts about each topic as well. And so the nice thing is that people are clearly paying attention. I think the last time I checked, this program had about 400,000 downloads of our reviews. We're also getting awards from clinician and patient groups. But of course, this is by no means perfect either. So we publish about 6 of these reviews a year. We get requests for about 50 products. So we are falling way behind in terms of things that people want us to review. Now, to try to help with that, we published something called 10 red flags. These are things that tend to be associated with the less promising alternative and off-label treatments we've looked at in the past 13 years. And so if you have a patient that comes into your clinic and says, hey, I want to try this, well, first thing to do is go on ALS Untangled and see if we've written about it. And if so, print out the article. These are written for non-scientists, and hopefully that will help them make a more informed decision. And if we haven't written about it, sit down with them and go through this list of 10 red flags and see how many of these are associated with the thing that they're thinking about buying and trying. This is not perfect either because it does require some work. And this is intimidating for non-scientists to try to look critically, at the thing that they're about to buy. Really, they would, I think, need help with their physician to do this well. And not all doctors are willing to sit down and do this. And so because of all that, I've started to explore expanded access programs. How many of you know what expanded access programs are? I only see one hand. Amazing. So I'm talking about something that people don't know about. That's rare in this place. Residents are usually so smart. You know everything. I try to teach you. So these are FDA approved programs. They actually came about in response to that Dallas Buyers Club situation that was happening in HIV. So 40 years ago, the FDA decided to create well-defined pathways that would allow certain eligible patients with terrible diseases to access investigational products outside of a trial. Now, the primary objective of these programs is to diagnose, monitor, or treat a patient's condition. It's not to obtain information about the product. So it's not like a trial. But I will say it is possible to obtain at least some information from these programs. And we'll talk about why I think that's really important. The FDA defines 3 categories of these. The most popular is individual patient. That's where one patient in your clinic says, I want to try this, and you agree that it's a good idea, and you approach the company and the company agrees, and then you get it for them. And those can be either emergency or non-emergency. Intermediate sized are the ones I like the best. Those can be anywhere from 2 to a few hundred patients. And then the one I've never had any experience with is a treatment IND or treatment protocol, which can really be open to everyone with a disease of interest. Requirements, the FDA says in order to participate, you got to have a serious or immediately life-threatening disease. There can't be any satisfactory alternative therapy. The doctor has to agree that the potential benefit justifies the risk. And this one is really important, providing the drug cannot interfere with a clinical trial. So there's some problems with EAPs. They're not a panacea. The first problem is there's not nearly enough of them. So for every spot in a clinical trial, there's only a fraction of EAPs. So in 22 years, I think I've enrolled 40 people in expanded access programs, and that was in 3 different ones, as opposed to about 300 people in about 20 different clinical trials. And it seems to me that for some reason, expanded access programs are less common in neurology than in other diseases like oncology and infectious disease. And I have a theory about why, which I'll share with you in a minute. So there is one more pathway. This is the newest pathway. It's called Right to Try. This pathway was created by a political group called the Goldwater Institute. They convinced everyone that the reason for the paucity of expanded access programs was the FDA. Turns out that is inaccurate. If you look at the history of expanded access at the FDA, they have approved 99% of all the expanded access programs applications they ever got. And many times they approve it within days of when they receive it. So that's wrong. But nonetheless, they convinced people, and hundreds of millions of people signed on to petitions across the United States. Some of you may have seen some of the protests. It quickly passed in 41 individual states, and then President Trump signed it into law in 2018. So this is essentially exactly like an expanded access program, except there's no requirement for the FDA to approve this. Now, I will say this is probably the single most misunderstood thing that I've ever seen my patients sign on to. And I think it has to do with the name. So the day after Trump signed this, my inbox blew up with patients saying, I want this, I want that, have the right to try it according to President Trump. No, neither expanded access programs nor this right to try law forces companies to give you the products they own, nor do they force doctors to support your request for a product. So it's really kind of misnamed. So again, the requirements are fairly similar. You got to have a terrible disease. There can't be any satisfactory treatment option. And you can't be able to participate in a clinical trial. You also have to be able to give informed consent. So I would say that this is even more scarce in terms of opportunities for patients than expanded access programs. So to use my disease, I'm only aware of 2 patients who've ever got a product through Right to Try versus about 300 who got products through expanded access programs. And I suspect the reason more people aren't getting it is by removing FDA oversight. I think that this law made physicians even more uncomfortable than this pathway and even more likely to want to support it. Like I would be uncomfortable. I would try to encourage oversight for their safety. So again, just to summarize this section of the talk, for people who can't be in trials, I prefer expanded access programs over Right to Try and over self-experimentation as a pathway for them to get investigational products. Because I think the things that are in EAPs have better defined pathways, better defined products, more safety oversight. And I love that intermediate sized expanded access program because there's an opportunity to gather some data. Now, of course, we're never going to be able to gather the same kind of data that we would gather in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. But there's a problem with our trials, many problems, as I told you earlier. One of them is we're only enrolling a certain type of patient. So when we get an approval, like this new drug Relyvrio, how do I know that it works in the 90% of my patients who couldn't have been in that trial? How do I know it's even safe or tolerable in people with more advanced ALS? I can't know that. But if I had patients in an expanded access program who were more advanced, I could at least have gathered some safety and tolerability data and have more confidence in prescribing it to them. But there are some barriers. The first one is a set of barriers at the level of the company. companies, they've invested a lot of money in these products and they perceive risk. They're afraid that if they open one of these up, it's going to affect enrollment in their trial. They're afraid if something bad happens in expanded access program, their whole trial program might get shut down. And then there's also a resource issue. Many of these companies are small companies. They might have leveraged every cent they had to do the clinical trial. They might not have a lot of money laying around to create a lot more product for people who can't be in the trial. But there's also barriers at our level. I think physicians, especially most neurologists, are very risk averse. Time is an issue. We're all stretched. And, at one time, it was very time intensive to do expanded access programs. So the time that it took for a physician was about 8 hours, and the entire process would take the physician about 100 hours to take care of their patient. You could see why that wasn't very popular. There's also a funding issue. I mean, when I do a clinical trial, I get a budget that pays for part of my time. It pays for my coordinator time. It pays for the procedures that the trial's asking. It costs about $10,000 per participant per year to do an expanded access program. And most of these do not have any budget. So that's a challenge. And then last but not least, there's a knowledge issue. So I did a survey of neuromuscular experts a few years ago. And the bottom line from the survey was I was kind of shocked that I was not the only one who didn't know much about these and wasn't very excited about participating. And so how do we deal with some of these barriers? Well, the good news is, long before I realized these problems with EAPs, I had started to build an army of patient advocates. And so I created something called ALS Clinical Research Learning Institute, training programs for patients and families who wanted to have a bigger impact on ALS research. And so we've now held 24 of these all over the world. We've trained 500 patients and family members to be what we call research ambassadors. And we meet with them now every month by video conference. And we parade different sponsors, different regulatory agencies, different patient advocacy groups in front of them to get their input and to galvanize them to help us. And they have been helping. And so when it comes to expanded access, these patient advocates have been out there meeting with companies and clearing up misconceptions, explaining to companies that it should not be possible. It says right in it for the clinical trial. Also, there are numerous published examples of EAPs that ran parallel to trials and had no effect on enrollment. And then finally, this idea that an adverse event might shut down a trial. Well, in the 40-year history of EAPs, that has never happened a single time that a harm outside of a trial shut down the trial. And then we're also working together with patient partners to develop educational resources, not only for patients, but also for physicians to make them more comfortable. And so we've got a whole website now that has articles, webinars, short videos, a step-by-step guide, a list of open ALS EAPs. And then for those who are trying to figure out how to make this work, there's a section on this website where you can actually get access to confidential information like templates, protocols, consent forms, budgets, timelines from previous expanded access programs to show you what this looks like. This year, we held our first expanded access workshop for ALS clinicians in Clearwater, Florida. And in 2023, we're going to start a one-on-one mentoring session with new investigators who want to do this for patients with ALS. And then last but not least, funding. So that's, one of the unmet needs until last year was how do we fund these? Most of the time, there's no budget. Well, in 2021, the patient advocates did something amazing. They got something called Act for ALS passed, $500 million in new federal funding. And part of this is the first ever federal expanded access grant program. And so now you can go on this website and you can see that if you're somebody like me, you can actually reach out to them, apply for a grant that would pay a sponsor for their product, that would pay for the direct cost that you would incur in monitoring and administering this, including personnel at your site. And I think this is going to be something that I'm going to want to explore more with Jennifer and Jessica. And then I said, last but not least, but there is one more important thing. I didn't know for most of my time here at Duke that we have resources to help physicians. Not every place does, but we're lucky. So one is we have nurse practitioners that a lot of us work with. One of the strange things to me was that when I tried to roll out my first expanded access program, I learned that I could not use a research employee to coordinate the program with me. So that's what I would do in a trial. is I would buy part of a coordinator from the Neurology Clinical Research Group. Can't use those people for expanded access because this is not considered to be research. So the first one I ever did, I entered all the data myself and I quickly realized that ain't going to work. I need to have a coordinator. So I found out that nurse practitioners who are primarily clinical can serve in this role. And I've got a really good one in my clinic, Sarah Parker. And then I also learned that there's a whole office here. And that's what you're going to hear from next. So Jennifer in research administration is going to take you through step by step how you do this, what websites you use, and then tell you a little bit more about what these programs look like over the history of Duke. Jennifer?
You want us to come up there and sit in front of the
Yeah, I think so,
computer?
because then you'll be on the camera. Yeah.
Start. Start. Okay. Take my mask off too. So I wasn't on the intro slide, but I'm Jessica Chapman. No worries. Came as a surprise. I'm a regulatory affairs scientist within the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality, or ORAQ, here at Duke. And Jen and I are excited to talk about a service that we offer here in collaboration with a number of other offices and individuals at Duke to support physicians who are interested in treating a patient or a small group of patients under FDA's Expanded Access Program. So if you have a patient that you're interested in treating under this program, again, as Dr. Bedlack was saying, there are a number of criteria that need to be met. So the patient needs to have a serious or life-threatening condition. They need to have exhausted all of their treatment options. They can't qualify for an existing clinical trial, and the benefits of the therapy need to outweigh any potential risks. Okay. Thanks. So if you have a patient or a small group of patients that meet all of those criteria, there are a number of, or 3 primary approvals that you need to seek. First is approval from the manufacturer of that investigational product. The next would be FDA authorization of the request or regulatory submission. And then finally, IRB approval. I did want to note that FDA authorization and IRB approval, those 2 pieces can be obtained in parallel, except in the case of an emergency request in which the patient would need to be treated in a matter of days or hours. In that case, treatment can proceed as soon as FDA authorization is obtained, and then the IRB would need to be informed within 5 working days. So as I mentioned, the first key step is to obtain approval from the manufacturer of that product. And so as Dr. Bedlack was saying, they have to agree to be providing their product under expanded access, and the FDA can't require that they do so. And there may be a number of reasons that that company would not allow the patient to be treated under expanded access. And that could be they have their own internal criteria for their program that the patient doesn't meet, whether it's lab values or mutations, that sort of thing, depending on the condition. Sometimes they don't have the resources or infrastructure. Dr. Bedlack touched on that as well, or there may be concerns that it would compete with their product development program. And this often comes up with more rare diseases. So the next step would be to obtain FDA authorization. So a regulatory submission must be prepared and submitted to the appropriate FDA review division, and then treatment can begin within 30 days after that submission or request is received, or if FDA notifies you earlier. And I will say that over the last 5 to 10 years, FDA has put a lot of resources towards expanded access. So they've really improved the number of people who are able to review these requests and the infrastructure around this program. So we've noticed that these requests, even though they have the 30 days by regulation to review, we often see that they're authorized within days or even a number of hours. And this is including requests that aren't for patients that needed to be treated emergently. And so once that FDA authorization has been received, this will need to be communicated to the manufacturer because this is required for them to ship the investigational product. And then finally, the last piece is IRB approval. So the treating physician must ensure IRB review and approval is obtained in accordance with the regulations, and then the patient must sign prospective urgency use, which I mentioned that treatment can begin as soon as FDA authorization is received. However, the IRB does need to be informed within 5 days in those situations. And absolutely.
Sounds like this only applied to the drug, does this apply to device? Can you repeat the question?
Yes, so he was asking if this applies to drugs specifically or devices. So the service that that we offer here is specifically for drugs only. Our office, ORAC, we can support compassionate use requests for devices, but there are different timelines and regulations around device requests. So we're certainly happy to talk about that if that would be helpful. Of course. And so for the case of individual requests specifically, FDA does allow a more streamlined process for IRB review, in which the IRB chair can actually concur on the expanded access use in lieu of requiring a full board review. So this is much quicker and, as I said, more streamlined. And with that, I will pass it over to Jen. Perfect.
I'm Jen Hamill. I am the Director of Research Operations in the Department of Medicine Research Office. Been at Duke for coming on 15 years. I will say that this process came out of a simple request from a couple of cardiologists who approached the Duke Office of Clinical Research Director and said, to Dr. Bedlack's point, I would love to be able to provide investigational drugs to patients who don't meet criteria for a clinical trial, but I just don't have the time as I'm rounding or engaging in clinic to provide and do all of this work to get drug to patients. So from that, we pulled together two of us actually in the beginning, Erica Seeger, who is in the Office of Regulatory and Affairs with Regulatory Affairs and Quality with Jessica. And so that pulled in the support on the regulatory side, and the insight that I was providing was from the research side, because this expanded access really bridges clinical and research, although it does fall in the clinical space because this is providing drug to patients, though investigational, but for the purpose of treatment. So where we started in December of 2016 with that inquiry was to understand who was supporting this work throughout the health system, and if any clinical services were supporting this, any clinical research services. So this was certainly eye-opening to us. It involved a lot of different offices that I'll share with you on the next slide. But one thing we did note right away is that clinical research staff were supporting effort and time on expanded access. And that wasn't allowable because in that research space, those research staff, their effort is supported by externally sponsored dollars, either federal or industry sponsored. So we were actually taking the effort from those staff and putting it on something clinical, though they were being supported by those external offices. So we really had to stop that once we became aware. And so we worked with the health system, who does provide supplemental support to the research staff who are putting effort to support this work. And then, as Dr. Bedlack said, there are clinical staff, physicians, nurse practitioners who can continue to engage in clinical support of that patient as they receive this treatment. But that support outside of that to get through manufacturer approval, FDA and IRB, is supported financially by the health system on a per expanded access request. So then we sort of did a bit of a road show, did electronic advertising of this resource. It was difficult to figure out how to get to physicians and nurse practitioners, PAs who would want to provide this expanded access treatment to their patients. So we very much appreciate Dr. Bedlack inviting us to come and speak with you. So our service went live. So the work started in December of 16, and by August of 2017, we had pulled these resources together and put it all through a REDCap workflow, which is a research electronic data capture system, so that as there's an initial request submission by a physician, it moves through, and I'm going to show you some detail about that as well. And then once we got going, we were able to work with the IRB that was changing from one IRB system into another. We were able to get in front of that and ask that we create a much simpler IRB service, so that the 50 things you might have to answer to get through a clinical trial was down to maybe 7 or 10 questions, so that we could get through this and use that regulatory coordinator's effort more wisely. And then we renewed that MOU with the health system in 2019. And since inception to current day, we have received 220 requests for expanded access. So it's been well received in the clinical community. And thank you to physicians like Dr. Bedlack who support this. So I know it's difficult to see on this slide, but I'm going to assume that you all will get a copy of these slides. And what this is demonstrating is really that workflow. So that first top left green box is the physician submitting the request. They submit some basic information about the patient without including any protected health information, but what the treatment would be, what the patient scenario is, the drug, the manufacturer, where that physician is in the process. Have they already gotten approval from the manufacturer to use this drug? Things like that, and just basic information like that, so that we can get started. And then that request goes to our pharmacy and therapeutics committee, who evaluates that drug coming into the health system to make sure that's something that is approved by them. I think in all cases up to date, that drug coming in has been approved. There may be some questions that we have to engage that physician in, but once that approval comes in, then the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Quality, ORAC, reviews that. They also review the physician's designation for whether that's emergency or non-emergency as a request. And then ORAC will submit a selection in that REDCap system to alert the rest of the ORAC team and the regulatory coordinators, who then can get the initial IRB started. Works with the manufacturer to make sure that that manufacturer has truly approved use of that drug for that physician to use at Duke. Once we have that confirmation of manufacturer approval, then that releases that whole gray row and engages the multiple offices that we discovered are a part of this process. So those parties are the Office of Research Contracts. So we have some contractual language with the companies we work with, including confidentiality agreements that we are managing that patient's health information appropriately. And then we have the investigational drug services who prepare that drug for that patient. And then we have the institutional review board, the IRB. The physician is kept aware and abreast of progress throughout the process. So as certain parts are approved and moving forward, the physician is always included in that. The regulatory coordinator is also working with the IRB to ensure that we can get IRB chair concurrence in order to be able to consent that patient and release drug. And then Maestro Care works on building that order in the Maestro Care system so that we can release that drug and have that reported in Epic. So once all of that is moving through, as that's all moving through, ORAC is also, and we have manufacturer approval, ORAC then works with the FDA to get their approval. And if we do get that FDA approval, and like Dr. Bedlack said, that's been our experience, that FDA is very likely to approve use of that treatment at Duke, then we can get a full approval that is released through that REDCap system to all parties involved. And then the physician can consent the patient and provide drug. So I've already said a little bit about this. This is the parties that we work with across the health system in order to get treatment to patient. So what I've described is for individual patients specifically, because that's where we started. But now we are working with intermediate IND requests. So where that differs a little bit is some additional work, because this is now multiple patients rather than one patient. So ORAC very initially determines whether Duke is sponsoring the drug, or if it's the manufacturer who's sponsoring that IND, I should say. And so if the drug is sponsored by Duke, then ORAC is involved in moving that through that network that I showed earlier. And if the manufacturer has already engaged and they have a protocol and they've already said that they're willing to work with that physician, then ORAC just doesn't need to be as engaged, because that work's been done. It's been approved by the FDA, and we can then work on the components, those other components like IDS, IRB. Contracts may not be involved if the IND is not sponsored by Duke. We did add research coordinators, because now this may include multiple patients. And this work, once it moves into the intermediate IND space, mimics research a bit more, and sponsors want more data. So it is not uncommon that sponsors say, hey, we'd like to have a site initiation visit. We'd like a delegation of authority log to understand who is engaging in some element of, I'll say, research activity, quote unquote. So we have a research coordinator who may be submitting data to the sponsor via their own electronic data capture system. They're definitely looking for more data, which is a good thing, but it's a time-consuming thing. So we need to make sure that those research coordinators were engaged in addition to the set of regulatory coordinators. So they are supported separately by the health system. And then the Maestro care and administrative support remains in line with the single patient INDs. So this, to understand how a physician would request expanded access at Duke, they would go to the ORAC website, and they would see on that individual patient IND service section of the page that red individual patient IND request survey button. And that would bring them into the REDCap, where they would enter that information that I described earlier. There's the list of information that the physician might request. It defines expanded access, what criteria are required for a patient to be enrolled in expanded access, and whether it's emergency or non-emergency. Once we move through those steps that alert those departments that I showed earlier in that schemata slide, that REDCap sends out alerts along the way until we have from the individual patient IND request through to approval for treatment. I know we're running out of time. We just have a few minutes. So I just wanted to show some numbers of and departments that are most likely to use or request expanded access. So we have the drug and biologics in those two columns. The first is the CDER, Drug Evaluation and Research Center. And that just shows you the breakdown of the divisions that use it. So at the top are the oncology products, and they're broken down into different therapeutic areas and grouped into products 1, 2, and 3. And then we have the antivirals in second there, and anti-infectives are third at 15 INDs over the time that we've had this open at Duke, and then neurology has submitted 7. Just to give you an idea where you sit, and then you can see the others that you'll be able to see when you get the slides. And then the expanded access requests overall at Duke have been 220, as I said earlier. And then the time that this takes, right? So we have emergency and we have non-emergency for single patient only. And then we have the intermediate sized population. Those don't come through as emergencies, but certainly we try to work as quickly with those as we can. Intermediates do require full IRB, so they take longer. And like I said, there's just some more oversight contracts are more involved. So those do take longer with a number, an average of 80 days for the 14 intermediate INDs that we have processed at Duke. And then single patient, those emergency, you can see we can get them through from patient request to IRB chair concurrence or reporting it to the IRB if we treated the patient before IRB approval in 8 days. That's pretty fast. Not much moves through the Duke system in 8 days at Duke. And then non-emergency is 39 days for that number of the 86. And then this is just showing you the requests by year. So what you can see is in the beginning in 2017, that number is small. And then in 2018 through 2020, we stayed consistently in the low 30s. We had a significant bump in 2021. That is not related to COVID, at least not directly. So we're not entirely sure why we had such a significant, twice what we had in other years. We did ask other collaborating health institutions, which we work with them on a grant for other expanded access related issues. And we told them that this is what we saw, and they're looking at their data to see if they had a bump as well. We're not really sure why that is.
I'll give you a theory.
Yeah, tell us.
So, I mean, during the COVID pandemic, a lot of research trials shut down. So even though that's not directly related
Right.
to COVID, there might have been a lot less opportunities for patients to go into a trial.
Mm,
So this might have been the only way they could get it.
Okay.
Maybe it's a theory.
okay. Yep, makes sense. And then we're back to 32 so far in 2022. The ORAC website is here. If there was interest in, if anyone knew of a physician wanting to submit a request, that is where you'll access that hyperlink. We've informed, obviously, and worked closely with IRB and IDS. So if you couldn't remember which department it was, those resources would certainly be able to point you in that direction.
I'll just say two more things and then we'll wrap it up.
Yep.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Coming over. Yeah, so I mean, not surprisingly, with what I told you, my growing interest and understanding of these and the new resources, financial and Duke resources, this is becoming a bigger part of my practice. I expect it to become even bigger. It's certainly exploding nationwide in my field. There's so many more people that have ideas about research. And as a result, I think we're going to see a lot more expanded access programs in my field, and I would expect in yours as well. So just to summarize, I mean, people living with disabling, life-shortening illnesses like the ones we treat, they want investigational treatments. And trials are my preferred pathway. EAPs would be my next best. We've got some barriers to these, but now we have patient advocate partners. We've got new educational resources, federal funding, and institutional resources that should help us to overcome these. So I'll stick around and answer questions. I don't know, Jen and Jessica, if you have a few minutes to answer questions, but looks like some things came in the chat.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks everybody. So Keevan Van Landingham had a few comments. And Keevan, can you give us your background just so we understand how plugged in you are?
So I practiced at Duke for 14 years, and then I left Duke to go to pharma, and I was with pharma for 14 years, GSK, and then GW Pharma, Greenwich Biosciences, where we had an extensive EAP program for cannabidiol. It was indispensable for drug-drug interactions and getting experience with the drug. It was phenomenal. A couple points, I posted documents that are available on the FDA website. If you're interested, I advise you go through them. Some of them are a bit lengthy and very detailed, but again, that's what you need to go through. The next thing just to state is don't call FDA and say, I want to get an expanded access unless it's an emergency approval. That still is going to need some agreement with the sponsor that you've got access to the drug because it's their drug. And kudos for Duke. I'm impressed to hear all this that's changed. I mean, when I was at Duke, to even think about an expanded access program was a leap of faith. But I'm amazed that Duke has taken the responsibility, because you've got to think about the downside on the legal side of it. If a patient has an adverse event or heaven forbid, an early death due to this compound that you're treating them with, there are going to be medical legal issues that need to be resolved. And so that's a slippery slope to be involved with. But if you're interested, contact the sponsor first. You need that agreement. The first link that I gave you will give you some of the documents that you need to fill out. They're very short. And again, the turnaround for an emergency access is 24 hours. So you should be able to get, even on weekends, we've got medical clinical reviewers that are available to review these documents when they come in. And the turnaround can be very quick, but good work, Rick.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. So Joel had an interesting question. Let's say I want to give a patient Nuplazid, which is approved, but their insurance turns them down. Can you go to a program like this to get them an approved drug?
No. So that would be an example of what I showed you before. It would be self-experimentation with a prescription for an off-label use. And to my knowledge, there would be no resource to get that paid for. I mean, there's no patient assistance programs that are going to pay for a product that a patient is using outside the FDA label. But expanded access is specifically for drugs that are not approved for any reason. So
What if it's within the FDA approval, but the insurance denies it?
expanded access has nothing to do with patients not being able to afford their medicine. It's got nothing to do with that.
The only caveat, Rick, would be if the patient had an illness that was not the approved indication. If they had an IND that was already open, say you're using this for ALS and somebody wants to use it for SMA or something else that's a degenerative disorder, that possibility is available if the sponsor is willing to provide drug and coverage,
Interesting.
insurance coverage.
Just go ahead. Wayne, you gotta get close. They won't hear
So
you.
FDA doesn't approve the drug, so I'm guessing insurance doesn't pay for it. Does patient pay for the cost or the sponsor pay for the cost?
So in an expanded access program, it could go either way. So more and more, we're seeing that sponsors will cover the costs because there's now money,
Cover the
federal
cost
money.
For the drug or?
Yes.
For all the labeling, all the ancillary costs?
Well, some do both. So the most recent one that I did had a budget that looked very much like a clinical trial budget.
I see.
But at the very least, most sponsors will pay for the cost of the drug.
It's not about the drug, it's also the whole thing.
Believe me, I understand.
Yeah.
Especially when it's a drug that's not oral. This is one of the reasons. I mean, one of the hardest decisions for me was we could not figure out a way to roll out the tofersen expanded access program because it's an intrathecal infusion. So Biogen said, we'll give you the drug. Yeah, but the problem is then where am I going to get clinic space, somebody to, do the LP, somebody to sit there and run this thing in every month. We just couldn't figure out how to make it work. But companies more and more have the resources now. And then there's that grant program to pay like you would pay for a research program. And this is something that I want to come over and talk to your office about because I do feel like it's an unmet opportunity here. You made tremendous progress, but the next level is to figure out how to accept money like you would accept for a research study, but for an expanded access program. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Really great.
Thank you, Rich.
Don't touch. I gotta
That's
see
yours.
what happened here.
That's yours. This mine. Yeah, this is mine.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much.
Are you?
Say that again,
Thanks for
sorry.
coming over. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.